It is said that there are 9 arts. And what if video games is the 10th? I'm Charles Adam Foster Simard from Ubisoft. You're listening to The 10th Art, a podcast series about the place of video games in entertainment, culture, and society. When we were preparing this season of The 10th Art, I knew one of the topics I wanted to tackle was artificial intelligence. It's a concept that's been around for my entire life, and one that has always been intertwined with the evolution of video games. But now, it feels like we've come to a turning point in AI, especially in the field of generative AI. Technology that can create original content like texts, images, video, or audio based on millions of existing files. New software like DALL-E and Stable Diffusion have made a splash this year for their ability to create images from any text prompt. This fall, generative AI startups attracted hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. It's certainly one of the hottest things in Silicon Valley right now. But generative AI also poses a lot of interesting questions for creators, artists, programmers, the kind of people who work in video game studios. Challenges around ethics, creation, ownership, but also safety and bias. To explore this topic, I invited Yves Jacquier, Executive Director of Ubisoft La Forge, our R&D department, as well as Dr. Sasha Lucioni, a research scientist at Hugging Face and an expert on AI and machine learning technology. So I'm here now with Yves and Sasha. Thank you so much for both joining us today.
Thank you. Hello. Hey, Sasha.
Our pleasure. Hey.
Maybe we can begin just by introduction. So I'll start with you, Sasha. If you can just briefly introduce yourself, what you do, and maybe how you got into the world of AI as well, how you became interested in that technology.
Sure. So my name is Sasha Lucioni. I'm a research scientist at Hugging Face, and I work on essentially evaluating AI models, algorithms, and trying to see how they impact society and the environment. And I got into AI almost 10 years ago. I did a first internship, and it was in extracting information from Wikipedia, essentially trying to build knowledge graphs by scraping Wikipedia and kind of extracting sentences. And it was very, old school at the time. Now there's much smarter ways of doing it, but that's where I learned how to program and how to do, basic AI approaches.
Super interesting. So AI via Wikipedia.
Exactly.
More or less. And what about you, Yves?
So I'm Yves, and I'm Executive Director of Ubisoft La Forge, which is Ubisoft's own R&D department. We started 6 years ago. And basically what happened is that a while ago, I think it was in 2009 or 10 or something, we were discussing, I really wanted with universities, with productions, and we really wanted to make sure that as Ubisoft, we would be ahead of the technical innovations. And at that time, I had discussions with people at Université de Montréal on a new topic that was emerging, starting to have some sort of results called machine learning, actually. And that was using a lot of data to basically generate new content. And because we have a lot of data, I started to get more and more interested on what it can do, but also all the limitations. And it was concrete when we started a chair with Yoshua Bengio in 2011, thus leading to the creation of La Forge, where we learned a lot working with Yoshua on the topic. And that's why we decided to go further and create La Forge for that.
And I know over the years there's been a lot of research papers and really interesting prototypes and all kinds of interesting technologies coming out of La Forge, and then being used in game production, but also sometimes just advancing like scientific research into these topics, right, Yves?
Well, we contribute to. We are not. We want to make sure that La Forge bridge the academic world with Ubisoft. So we want to work with researchers who are, who create knowledge, or who that's their objective, create public knowledge, and we want to facilitate that by providing them access to our data, our expertise, our infrastructure. When we can contribute to creating public knowledge ourselves, we definitely do it. But I wouldn't say that we are playing in the same league as the researchers.
Before we dig into the conversation of AI and what it can do for video games, and also what it's, what we're hearing as well, kind of outside of video games right now, especially with generative AI, I just want to go a little bit clearer into some of the terms, especially I think artificial intelligence and machine learning, which you dropped yourself, Yves. So can you define in your own words and in layperson's terms, what is artificial intelligence and what is machine learning for you? And maybe we can start with you, Yves.
Okay. To me, it's a system, whatever that is, that takes human-grade decisions. But the issue with this definition is that it's something that evolves in time. If you think about that, spell check, for example, today you consider that as a feature in whatever editor you're using, while it would have been considered as pure witchery at Gutenberg's time. So it shows that it evolves as we better adopt those systems and technology that somehow assist us. Today, when you hear AI, it's often a word used in place of a very specific discipline of artificial intelligence and computer science called machine learning. What's new here is that instead of coding the results, if these happen, then do that, the idea is to create rules based on data that represents many different examples of what you want to achieve. That would be my way to put it.
Yeah, very clear. And we're going to dig into that in a minute, maybe using video games as an example. But Sasha, do you have anything to add in terms of just base definitions?
I think that it's useful to add that artificial intelligence, the term, has existed since the 1950s. And the goal was really to imitate human intelligence using machines. And it's evolved a little bit since, definitely. But I guess the intention has been around for a while.
And Yves, you mentioned AI and how it's sometimes maybe misunderstood, or only one part of it is understood, and it's kind of more of an umbrella word. And I know when we talk about video games, often we talk about AI, but what we're really talking about is like NPC behavior, enemy behavior, right? We hear players complain that the NPCs aren't realistic and how they see the player if you're doing a stealth game, or if enemy NPCs aren't reacting correctly if you're in a shooter game, for example. So can you talk a little bit about, is that a kind of a misnomer calling that AI in video games, and how is AI actually used in video games at the moment?
Okay, you're totally right. I mean, most of the time when in the industry or the gamers themselves use the word AI, it's in place of NPC, of the non-playable characters.
Yeah.
But and their behaviors and the way that apparently they react to the gamers' inputs. The thing is that what's interesting, though, is that most of the time when gamers relate to AI, it's more they relating to the manifestation of AI. So, for example, sometimes there's a problem in the animation, not necessarily in the AI, but that's what the gamers see. However, to answer the question in terms of where it's used, the way we structure that is to be used in three different targets. The first target is creators' assistance, and the idea is to help creators doing the more repetitive or less valuable tasks. For example, if you want to create a large variety of faces in a crowd and be true to the real variety that you would find in real life, it could become very repetitive. So that's when automated methods brought by machine learning are very valuable. The second is when it comes to creating more believable worlds, because machine learning does not require to implement rules, the if this, then that. It's way easier to scale, for example. If you want to add more diverse animations for or different environments, for examples. Finally, it can also impact the player's experience directly. For example, if you want to predict that two players should be matched because of their gaming abilities profiles, or another example is to spot harmful content online within our chats, for example. And that's when AI is targeted to enhance the player experience.
And in the last example, for example, it's because the machine learning would be able to adapt and learn if there are new words or ways that players are using to kind of try to counter or avoid those rules regarding harmful content that they could be communicating in the game chats, for example, right?
Yes, that's definitely part of it. Most of the tools from the shelf that you find are either too generic or are based on dictionaries. And we know that it's very easy to bypass dictionaries. And
all you need to do is change a character or whatever. And
exactly, and you need to update that all the time. And plus, it doesn't scale. You need to do that in any languages. You need to also take into account the context as well. Because, for example, if a player says, "I'm going to take you out," it can be part of a fantasy of a shooter game, while in other contexts it might be simply a threat or not acceptable. So this is why such techniques in terms of scalability becomes very interesting.
And how do you use machine learning to figure out what the intention is?
Oh, we're working on that. Actually, we are. No, it's a very good question. We have started a project focusing on chat lines, actually, and we want to first detect any type of harmful content. We have created a prototype that is able to detect roughly 80%-ish of harmful content out of the entire data set of examples, I would say. And now we're working on two different aspects. One, which is refining the understanding of the context of the game. What's the context of the chat lines, to make sure that we do not have too many false positives, for examples, and that we're able to refine the type of harmful content. Is it a threat? Is it I don't know,
an insult,
or whatever. So that's one aspect. We also work on making sure that we do not introduce bias into that, because maybe in some culture, some linguos or some expressions might, be understood differently, whether it's from different cultures or from different crowds, basically. And we have recently announced a project with Riot Games. It's a joint R&D project, actually, to exchange data. Because obviously the issue that we have is that we do not have enough examples of some specific harmful content. So we're working on sharing that, but while preserving privacy and confidentiality, obviously, and find a blueprint to do that. And then out of that, be able to train different type of models.
I want to go back to the first example you used for AI in game development, which was, let's say, an artist creating or assisting an artist in creating many different faces for characters in a game, for example. That sounds to me a little bit like generative AI, which is something that I've at my level have heard a lot about this year with things like Stable Diffusion and DALL-E last summer, which is essentially, right, you can, for image generation anyway, you can just input whatever text. I could input octopus typing on a keyboard in the sky, and these AI models would generate images that fit that description, basically. Sacha, I'd like to ask you why we've been hearing so much about this year. Like, do you feel that these AI technologies are kind of at a turning point right now?
Well, they've gotten really realistic. I guess a couple of years ago, we had GANs, or generative adversarial network. So you could, for example, train a GAN on a set of images of people, faces, and then it will generate other faces, but it won't generate something that you can't say, like, a woman with glasses and freckles, like, or the blue hat. You can't say that to a GAN. It's just kind of, you can do some guided stuff, but it's quite complex. Whereas now you can use a Stable Diffusion or any of those similar models. You can use them almost like a paintbrush, right? Like you can imagine something that you want to see, and then you can use it to paint. And they've gotten quite realistic, and so that's why people, I think, it captured the imagination of people. Because text, of course, it's cool when you can like talk to GPT, or it responds to you in some way. But this is really creative. It's a new modality that people are excited about.
Now, you're both in this field. What is your reaction to this technology? Do you look at the limitations? Do you have questions? What are you kind of interested in?
I think that it's such a new technology that we don't really know its limitations yet. And so, for example, in terms of content, safety filtering of content. So we've been working at Hugging Face to figure out Hugging Face is a platform where people upload models and data sets essentially, and it helps sharing, it helps, versioning, things like that. The GitHub of AI. So people upload, for example, Stable Diffusion, and we want to help them understand what this model can and can't do, what is really things that you should and shouldn't use it for, maybe, and what are some approaches that we can help to make sure that people are protected to some extent from harmful content, kind of like what Yves was saying. But so there's a difference, because if someone say prompts Stable Diffusion with a prompt that's violent or sexual, and the model generates that, that's one case where you can say, okay, well, I want some, whatever, murder, and it generates murder, but that's kind of something that you've sought out. And on the other hand, it's when you have, when you're just saying, a man walking in a street, and all of a sudden it generates someone who's violent or killing someone,
right.
And that's something you don't want. But that's a fine line to, that example was maybe not particularly precise, but there are certain terms that do generate content that could be very sexual.
Yeah.
For example, terms like stepmother, stepsister actually generate a lot of nudity, and probably people aren't looking for this, but if you have you're playing around, you're like, hey, my stepmom in a park with my brother, and then all of a sudden you have nudity, you're not expecting that, and it's important to kind of draw the lines of where the models can generate harmful content. So this is what we've been focusing a lot and trying to understand, essentially, are there ways of protecting people? Are there ways of helping, filter out not safe content? And what are some techniques, either during the process when people are interacting or after the images have been generated, to filter out things that people wouldn't want to see, essentially.
Yves, what has been your point of view, or what have you been interested in taking a look at with these kinds of technologies?
So far, we're trying to understand the real limitations. What's a fair usage of that? Beyond the creation and everything that Sasha was saying, how to make sure that we can provide safe content, and making sure that we are able to provide really what people would ask for, just like you're using a search engine casually today. What we're trying to understand is what are the limitations of such techniques, for example, whether it's in terms of quality, and each month, maximum, you have a new enhancement algorithm product in this area. So it's going extremely fast, and you have a lot of investments being done. We're talking about billions. So it explains also why it's going so fast. However, our take is really, when should it be used and when should it not be used? And there are questions of data management, rights, fairness, and all of that, plagiarism, bias, for example. Let me take an analogy. For example, let's talk about music. If you take samples of another song, it is a song both from a legal and artistical point of view. If your own input as a creator, as a musician, creates a new proposition out of that. Otherwise, it's called plagiarism, right? Just you copied something. Now, imagine a world where there is no legal frame to use samples. A world where the only songs that would be available are, let's say, disco songs that are sung by males in German. New songs that you would create out of that would likely be disco songs, and probably with German voice stems, for example. And those generated songs would be added as well to the available data set, to the available samples. So in other words, if we do not pay attention to the data diversity, bias as well, but also the responsible and fair usage, if not legal, we'll live soon in a world where everybody can generate German disco songs and nobody can make a living out of it. So it's really the kind of thing that we're trying to making sure when we understand the output of those systems, just to make sure that we remain fair with the creators who inspired those outputs.
I mean, there's several thorny issues that you bring up there, and one for sure I've read about some artists, right, who I guess their art ended up online, and so it's kind of part of the data set for these tools, and so if you put in their names, you end up with art created by these AIs that look just like theirs, or that are clearly kind of using some of their art, right? So there's definitely like a copyright question there and a fair use question. I'm really interested in the question of bias as well, because you brought it up, Eve, and Sasha. I've looked a little bit on your Twitter, and I've seen some interesting examples where you're kind of testing these models for bias as well.
Yeah, it's so part of our mandate, I guess, is to understand the biases of the models that people upload, and so I've been trying to look at different diffusion models, so different image generation models, text image generation models, and comparing them. I guess the idea is not so much of producing a score or any kind of absolute metric, but to say, well, this one has a bit more diversity. This one, I don't know. For example, you can see which images were filtered out. I mean, even if you don't really know why, you can see like, well, this particular term triggered the safety filter in this model.
Right.
So essentially, you're trying to figure out how these models, as Eve said, like, I mean, they're trained on pretty relatively diverse data, not diverse enough, I guess. It's never is. So there is some diversity, but the thing with machine learning models is that they tend to learn patterns. I mean, that's kind of what they do. And so, for example, if an text-to-image model was trained on, for example, images of doctors, it can be that 95% of these images are men and 5% are women,
right,
but the dominant pattern is men, for example, white men. And so models tend to kind of hone in on what constitutes kind of the pattern of a category or the pattern of a population.
Yeah.
And they'll actually tend to make that 95 into 100 unless you kind of train it with specific mechanisms, with weighting and things like. I mean, there are techniques, but typically, if you just like put the data in, it's going to learn the dominant pattern,
right.
And that's kind of the problem, because of course you can say, well, these models are mirrors of society, but they're carnival mirrors to a certain extent.
Right, it's more complicated. They exaggerate what already exists as biases in our society, basically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, and it's true for anything. Like if you train a model on any kind of imbalanced data, it's quite hard to get the model to focus on the minority class. And this is true for any kind of model, even with numerical data. If you're working with numbers and you have a class that's like 10% of the data set you're working with, it's hard to get the model to really learn what makes that class as opposed to another one, because there's less samples. The other one is kind of dominating. It's kind of more present. And so this is kind of like a well-documented problem. But since text-to-image models are so new, we don't really know to what extent they reflect or amplify bias.
Fascinating. What are some of the other ethical concerns that you're looking at for these models that you're kind of studying to make sure, well, to see, where the concerns are and where we need to look at and correct those?
Well, something that we're looking at that's, I guess, it's an ethical concern, is how to mark these images so that people know that they're fake. Because, I mean, maybe now you can still kind of see that these are not, I mean, sometimes it's very, very realistic to the point that you really can't tell. But, maybe we're not quite there yet. But, I would say 6 months, we would be in a situation where you can really say, I don't know, Sasha doing something that Sasha didn't really do, right? And then someone posted that on the internet. And it's, if you find this image somewhere out of context, how do you know it's been generated? And so, for example, what OpenAI has been doing, they've been putting a little rainbow bar essentially at the bottom of the image, but people have been cropping that out,
right?
Like, obviously, right? And you don't want to put something that's like in the middle of the image, because people tend to want to see the image. And so we've been trying to figure out if there's like invisible watermarks that you can put so that they're not visible when a human looks at them, but if you run them through like a program, you can check if like a certain pattern is present, like on a pixel level, but it's kind of very subtle. You're modifying pixel values in a very kind of way that humans can't see the difference.
Mm-hmm.
And that way, for example, if a journalist or a policymaker or someone finds an image, they can try to check whether this image has been generated and which model, for example, has generated it. And of course, none of these methods are perfect, because if you wanted to, you could remove the watermark, but the idea is like, okay, if someone is technical enough to do that, it's hard to stop them. But if it's just a random image in a random place, we want to give people the tools so that they can check the provenance of that image and kind of fact check it.
We're talking a lot about images, and I also don't want to just focus on images because these kinds of AI are also there for audio, for video. So we're seeing them also in other, because you were mentioning like something that Sasha didn't do, but then, something that Sasha or a politician or whatever didn't say as well, right? Potentially we're going to see these models be very realistic in what they can create and recreate in terms of video and audio, which I think brings in potentially even trickier area.
Yeah, I think that for audio, I don't know. Yeah, it's hard to say, I guess. I'm hoping people will get more, not really suspicious, but a bit more critical.
Right.
And will fact check. But because now if we see an image of like, I don't know, like a world leader holding a sign and then it says like, whatever, let's start a nuclear war, people tend to like try to go and figure out whether this is a real image. I mean, of course, not everyone, a lot of it is becoming, I guess, more wary of the provenance of content. Mm-hmm. But I mean, it's like, the thing is with machine learning is that it's very distributed. It's of course there's like some dominant players, but anyone with sufficient voice samples of any person can develop a very realistic imitation algorithm. And so it's really hard. It's like you can't control people who do things that are harmful or potentially harmful.
Yeah. Yves, anything to add on this perspective?
Oh, I totally agree with everything that Sasha just said. Now the technology is really able to trick us, and then it's way more a question of usage, because everything in terms of watermarking or trying to find technical solutions to the technical problem, I think won't be sufficient, because there's always a trick that bypass the trick, and which is why it's a very complex problem. So it's way more a question of usage, and it's also a question of raising awareness, making sure that those technologies are now at these levels. I don't have a solution. It's extremely complex because it's not a technical answer. We cannot have solely a technical answer to that. It's a lot of education. It's a lot of raising consciousness of the fact that it can hurt people. That when some people create nude pics, for example, from other people with such technologies, it's not only it's bad, it's unethical, but it's hurting real people. So it's a kind of raising consciousness of everybody that what is the kind of world we want to live in.
Well, these are really interesting concerns, and I think you've offered some kind of potential solutions or some areas of solution. I'd like to continue on maybe a more positive note, and I'll ask you both the same question, which is, what area of AI or machine learning are you most excited about? What's the thing that you're looking out for, that you have your eyes on, and that really, gets you really excited and hopeful for what's coming next and for the future? I'll bring it back to you, Sasha.
So I've been involved with an organization called Climate Change AI for the last, I think almost 3 years at this point. And it really gives me hope because it brings together people from the AI community and actually other communities like the biodiversity community, the ecology community, and essentially tries to find ways of using these AI, like these cool AI techniques, but in a way that's kind of climate positive and planet positive. And we really started gathering kind of mass, like critical mass. I feel that we have like, hundreds of people involved at this point. And every year, like we organize a workshop and more people submit. And I really see like the connections being made. At the beginning it was kind of, we were trying to show people, oh, look, you can do this with that. And oh, look, there's data here. You can use AI to analyze this data instead of doing it by hand. And I think it's starting really to stick. And, people come up to me and they say, oh, like I read a paper or I read like the website or something. And now I'm like using my skills in reinforcement learning or computer vision to detect, deforestation in the Amazon. And I find that, really great because people channel their technical expertise in a direction that's good for society, I would say.
And becoming maybe more and more creative also with what they can do with the tech, right?
Exactly.
And what about you, Yves?
Yeah, I totally agree. What's fascinating is that it's going very fast. It's still going very fast in what's happening in machine learning in general. And we've seen many good examples where it creates bridges with other disciplines, whether it's climate experts or artists who still are experts of their own domain, but now have new toolings, new possibilities. It's unlocking many different things. So when it's targeted for the greater good, it's just fantastic. For us and for our industry, I really think that it's going to unleash creativity through more accessible tools, for example. And that will accelerate creativity for both seasoned artists, I think, or designers, but also for amateurs. If I reuse the songs and sample analogy, if we have diverse and quality samples, if we have very accessible tooling, everybody can create a decent song. And people who could not do it would see their creativity unlock and would be able to express themselves, while seasoned musicians can probably accelerate the path from the idea to the final song or product or music, while being able to iterate and explore at scale as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I see this as unlocking things that were not possible before. And our work is to make sure that it's unlocked for the to enrich the experience of people and to create values and not be harmful. So when you think about user-generated content, it means that soon everybody will be able to create 3D content to put in virtual worlds, because the tooling, the processes and the data will be accessible. With a simple smartphone today, you can scan a chair, for example, and put that in a virtual environment in a matter of minutes, even though you're not a 3D model specialist.
Yeah. I love that, because I think for me, video games has always been, or I've always seen it as technology and art coming together, right? You had obviously the tech side of just how it's built and how it's made and the interactivity of it, and then the artist side, where you have obviously artists and designers and of course composers and so forth and actors. But it's like what you're saying now is this technology is almost is like underlying the creativity itself. It's like unlocking further creativity and then even bringing that to the players and allowing them to create and them to have their hand in creating the worlds that they want to see and that they want to play in.
Yeah, totally. But to be able to reach that and to put that in this direction, we just need to make sure that we take care of, whatever lies behind those technologies. So that otherwise we'll just end up with disco songs in German, which is cool, but
Well, it's a fascinating and sometimes mind-blowing topic. So Yves and Sacha, I want to thank you both for joining us today and help shine a little bit of a light on these technologies, which will be, following with a lot of interest in the future. So thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Sacha.
To learn more about Ubisoft's homegrown tech, including research in AI and machine learning, visit ubisoft.com/technology. Thank you for listening to this episode of The 10th Art. Make sure you don't miss any of our episodes as they come out. Subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. ubisoft.com/The 10th Art podcast.